Welcome to the Design for Impact podcast. I'm Cara Prosser, an Aussie in London, an experienced designer and strategist obsessed with fixing the world's most broken systems.
And I'm Philip Lockwood-Holmes, an Englishman in Edinburgh, not New York. I work with leaders and organizations helping to turn good intentions into real-world impact. We are your hosts as we meet some of the world's most ambitious thinkers, builders, and changemakers who are redesigning the systems that shape our lives.
From ethical AI and climate innovation to women's rights, healthcare, and humanitarian work, each episode dives into the real stories behind people doing the hard, meaningful work of change. But at its core, we're exploring how can you use design and creativity for impact. Hi, Rob. Well, welcome to the Design for Impact podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. I've been so looking forward to this episode.
Yeah, same here. Thank you very much for the invite. Looking forward to it.
And looking fabulous. You know, you're putting us to shame. And the microphone as well. A pro, looking amazing. Yeah, fantastic.
Thank you very much.
I wasn't going to say anything, but if anyone who's, listening on audio, you need to switch over to video to see Rob in his amazing, three-piece suit and tie pin and all. And very fitting because we're speaking about some really important things today. I think really the description of our conversation is going to be transforming and reimagining clinical trials. Yes. And you're all coming from it from such an interesting point of view with your background, but going to dive into, well, what does human-centered design really mean in clinical trials, and how can we drive better patient experiences? But before we get stuck into the nitty-gritty, we'd love you to introduce yourself, about your background, how you got into the work that you do right now, and a little bit about your role at the moment.
Yeah, of course. Rob Jones, based over in the UK, from Yorkshire, for anyone that can tell the accent. So I've been in clinical trials for 17 years. 2009 I started. So originally I was actually in the labs. I wore a white lab coat and everything. I was managing many different bodily fluids from many different things. So that was always fun. And what I was doing was analysing samples that came from clinical trials. So when the clinical trials were happening, there were samples sent to us. We would analyse them and see, what was actually in there, things like that. I did that for a few years, moved out of the lab because ultimately I just wasn't nerdy enough. The people that love the science, and I bowed out gracefully and said, look, you guys are experts. I'm just not. And I sort of bounced around doing a few things, always still in that area. But I moved probably in about 2017 into something called clinical operations. So clinical operations is very much the idea of almost project management of clinical trials. It's the operational side of things. And since about 2017, that has been my focus. I have got sort of a specialty in clinical trial records. So, if you think about how much paperwork is generated buying a car, renting a flat, now imagine running a clinical trial for 10,000 patients around the world. There's a fair bit of paperwork that needs to be collected. So I've sort of found my niche in that area. And with, I'm sure, everybody that you're speaking to right now, also very much diving into that AI piece. So my background is very much the technology, software, operations, processes, but centered around clinical trials and around the drug development process.
The next question is for you then, Rob, is what is human-centered design to you, and how do you see it coming to life in clinical trials?
Yeah, interesting one. So I think fundamentally it's probably quite similar to you guys. For me, it's around the idea of designing around the user first, not the buyer, not the builder, not all these other people, but the user. Now, a lot of my experience is as I've mentioned, software. That's where I've really sort of delved in with a lot of things. And I've seen really good human-centric design. And I have seen horrendous human-centric design. As you can imagine, working especially in the labs, very, very technical software, very, very in-depth. You're running mass spectrometry and liquid chromatography. The design aspect, let's say, is not always there, let alone the user-centric design or the human-centric design. It's very much built with this idea of having something that is just practical. And for me, really, human-centric design is having something that people want to use. It's having something that, as daft as it sounds, they should get joy from. You know, they should want to use it. There should be some sort of joy in using it. It should actually give them something in return. And that could be as simple as just a nice feeling. I have multiple, and you can't see them in this shot, I have multiple mechanical keyboards. Do I need multiple different types of mechanical keyboards? No. Do I just like typing on them? Yeah. Does it make me type any better? Not a chance. But I just like the feel of them. I like the different weights of them. I like just the way they look. And I spend all my time at a computer. So something that just has that bit of joy and spark and is designed around what I want and what I need, for me, that is a big part of it, you know, and having something that isn't a burden. And I think that's a real big thing for me, at least for the human-centric design, is giving people something that they need, having that joy, reducing the burden. All of that, at least for me, is human-centric design and really where I sort of see it being used. Now, the clinical trial aspect is where it gets even more interesting, really. And I think for a lot of people, they're doing it now without knowing they're doing it. So people like yourselves would walk into the room straight away and say, well, that's just human-centric design. Guys, you haven't created something novel and new. It's just human-centric design. But it comes from this... Yeah. But it comes from this idea of, and I'm sure we'll get onto it, you know, in a little bit about regulations, but it comes into this thing of things being so structured in clinical trials. And it is a industry that is very far behind. And I don't mean that too derogatory, but what I mean is it's built in a way that if it's not broke, don't try and fix it. You know, just keep doing what you're doing. And the regulations mean that you can't just change every week, every month, even every year. You know, to give you an idea, we've just had a new regulation. The last one was 10 years old. So really, now it's this idea of really wanting to have products that actually give real benefits to patients, you know, and actually takes in their needs. You know, if we think about it, an example I always use it with people is I talk about, you know, if you had an ingrowing toenail and someone said to you, you know, we've got a treatment to cure that, 100% effective, but you need to take daily injections, all your hair's going to fall out, and you're not going to be able to get out of bed for a week, but your toenail will be cured. No one's doing that. No, not a chance. So it's about understanding what people need. And I think especially with patients, it's now really understanding their needs, thinking about their lives, scheduling it. You know, you can't come up with a treatment for a kid which needs them to sit still for 15 minutes every hour to take it. That just ain't happening. So you need something that's going to be designed around the user, the patient. You need something that's going to fit in with them. The side effects aren't going to be too much. Ultimately, the side effects will be worth it. And I think there's more and more now that, yeah, to a certain extent, you know, I'm sure a lot of people are going, well, yeah, that is common sense. You know, why would you design something like that? But in the past, that's just kind of how it was because of these regulations, because people felt like they had been painted into a corner. Now we're seeing a lot more of real patient focus and patient first thinking, which ultimately is human-centric design.
You get Gold stars for that answer, Rob. It was incredible. Because as someone who doesn't got a design background, you get it. And it is so much about that common sense. And there's so much to unpack in what you said there. So I'm trying to sort of figure out where we start. Because I think for the listeners who don't really work in this space, a clinical trial is I guess actually this is going to be much better coming from you. Can you talk us through, I guess, not what a clinical trial is, but kind of, why, I guess, how we spoke about the other week, Rob, around kind of in the lab and then going through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, what that kind of means when you test on humans, why it's important, and then I guess how that's essentially the foundational business model of any pharmaceutical company, and kind of why it's such an important thing, right? Because I think that big pharma and clinical trials get a bit of a bad rap, but ultimately it's about getting life-saving and life-changing drugs and medicines to people who need it most. So take us away. You imagine you speaking to, I don't know, my mum. She's a very smart woman, but she probably doesn't really know this world that much.
Yeah. So I think one of the things to know straight away is to get a product to market, 10, 15 years. To get from I've got an idea to it's on a shelf and someone can buy it. We're not talking an overnight. We're not taking a couple of years. We're talking many, many years. To just get to the point of dealing with a human being, a participant, a patient, that in itself could be 5 or 6 years. It goes through so many things with, your classic R&D of people in white lab coats doing, science and looking at research models on computers, to the bit we never like to talk about, but the preclinical, as it's now called. When I was doing a lot of it, was toxicology, basically the animal testing, before we even get into humans, make sure it's safe. But once you get to the human part, it goes through multiple phases, is what it's called. You mentioned them. So it goes through, the basics is 3 phases. A phase 1 clinical trial is a very controlled, everybody's basically at a hospital, round the care, attention, everybody's checking on them. Not usually patients, we'd call them participants. People like you, me, the audience, probably fit and healthy, nothing wrong with them. They're going to volunteer to take a treatment and just see if it's safe. The last thing you want to do is give someone who's ill something that could have a side effect. So you give a very small amount to somebody who's already fit and healthy just to make sure it is okay. At some point you need to test on a human, and that ultimately is what you're doing there. A phase 2 clinical trial is where you are basically seeing, just does it work? Let's give it to a handful of patients, maybe multiple sites, hospitals around 1 country, 2 countries. Let's just see if it works. A phase 1 could be 6 to 9 months, by the way. A phase 2 could be 1 to 2 years. And then we get into what's called a phase 3, which is, I'm sure everyone's heard
Where
of these.
Where it gets exciting.
These are your massive, great, big, multi-country, thousands of patients all over the world taking this, this pill or this treatment every single day. And they're lasting 3, 4, 5 years. And there are stages to pass before you do the next one. There are data that needs to be collected. It needs to be reviewed. If you test it in a phase 1 and suddenly everybody gets ill, you're not going to go into a phase 2. You also want to see a little bit about the side effects. So I think this was a story I was telling when you and I caught up, Cara, that one of the best side effects I ever heard was I was reading through a report when I was in the lab, and one of the side effects was multiple patients think they are pirates, which is a fabulous, absolutely fabulous side effect. And what it turned out was this particular product had some level of hallucinogenic in it. And as I mentioned, a phase 1 is usually everybody in a centre together at a hospital, at a clinic. Well, usually what they'll do is they'll just get everyone together and watch movies, read books, play video games. And it just so happened they'd all been watching Pirates of the Caribbean. They've been watching Pirates of the Caribbean, all taken this product. The next day, all of the nurses and the doctors are speaking to pirates, and they're like, what on earth has gone on? But it's down in the side effects, of may think they're a pirate. Oh, eventually, of course, it was changed to, slight hallucinogenics, and we need to look at this, this, and this. But they're the things that that you're testing. So does that at least give a broad idea of the clinical trial space to then really dig into the regulations and the patient safety and everything else?
Yeah, that's perfect. Oh, do you have any questions, Philip?
Yeah, I was actually going to ask a question first, which is, so, clearly through all those phases, there's kind of the scientific design for rigor, but then there's the design of the experience to people taking part. And I guess earlier you talked about a couple of, I've had some winces. You see, I'm not an expert at this, but I was going to ask Rob in terms of kind of, you were talking about design and I guess kind of design appreciation, like with the keyboards and things. And your background in kind of data science, etc., kind of more technical. I guess how come, what in your life or why do you think this kind of appreciation for design has come through? What do you think the thing in your background is that kind of has led to that?
For me personally, sorry.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
I think it just comes from, I don't necessarily know what good is, but I know what bad is. And I think that's where a lot of it comes from is I love technology and I love just playing with technology and I love, even just being at my desk and working. But I like working with my own things. I kind of have this thing of, look, if you're going to be sat there for such a long period of time, there needs to be some level of joy there. I've used lots of software, and anyone who's in the corporate world knows what bad software looks like. There's some horrendous software out there that I'm sure people are using in their jobs. And I think for me, it just came from that idea of really appreciating what good looked like compared to bad. I always sort of say to people, I love watching tech keynotes, your Apple keynotes, your Google keynotes, and things like that, because I just love the design aspects of them. I love the theatre of it. I love the attention to detail of things. And I think for me, that always sparked something. I think it's the original Macintosh that Apple made. The people who created that actually wrote their names and signed the inside of it. Now, that was then printed into every single case. People never saw it. It was never anything that anybody who was a user saw, but the people who designed it knew it was there. And it gave them pride. And I think for me, that's where it's really come from, is that side of things, of seeing what bad looks like and then being able to sort of pick. I don't exactly know what good looks like, but I know it's in that direction.
All right, brilliant. Well, in that case, I'm going to let Cara ask the question, which is around how you kind of like design the experience, because obviously the way I phrased it got winces from both of you before.
No, the reason why you got like I don't even know which face I did. Obviously a scary one. I'm sorry, Philip. But you got a funny face because these experiences aren't designed. They're not designed.
Yeah.
So it is whatever the first bit you said was, which was like the science and stuff that. But in terms
of like the rigor of the practice, making sure the research comes back,
that's
you've got
all
the
there.
Evidence. Yeah.
Tick, tick, tick. But actually any thought around experience, as probably you and I know it, right, Philip, is not there. It's getting better and better, and I guess that's really the crux of this conversation and some of the really exciting conversations we've had, right, Rob, around if I'm a person and I have asthma or some other chronic illness and I'm looking for a way to manage my asthma, what's going to make me go on one pharmaceutical trial versus another, you know what I mean? Or if I've got a type of cancer, how do I even find out about this? And then how do I kind of, get on the trial, stay on it? So it's no one's really traditionally thought about it in this space. When we think about designing iPhones and apps and stuff like that, UX is a thing, but in clinical trials, it's just kind of only started to be a thing that we've stopped and gone, hang on a minute, let's actually think about the people who are involved in this service. Let's actually see it as a service and think about it. So it's a really, really exciting time. It's just historically pretty far behind, as you mentioned, right, Rob? So lots of questions for you. I think before I get stuck into my next question, I'd love you to tell us what regulation is. Like, what does it mean? Yeah.
So, as you can imagine, we're talking patients, we're talking people. There's rules. with that. If you kind of think about even the simplest things of, here in the UK, if you want your boiler looked at, you have to get a gas certified engineer to do it. There's regulations around things. When you build a house, there's regulations around, where the plug sockets need to be, how high plug sockets need to be. Now scale that to, we're going to be pumping humans full of drugs. There's a lot of regulation there. And you have an overarching regulation that's by a group called ICH, which is a large sort of group of the big regulators. Think your FDA, that's the biggest one everyone knows about in the US. You've got things like the EMA for Europe. You've got the MHRA here in the UK. They all kind of got together and said, right, at least what's that basic foundation? What's that guideline? And they came up with this idea of good clinical practice. And it's almost that idea of, we're not talking perfect clinical practice or great clinical practice, good. What is the foundation that we need to adhere to? So you have a guideline there, and then every country has their own regulatory agency who's responsible for their people, who, again, in the UK, we have the MHRA, who then have their regulations to protect their people. So
Rob, it's to keep us safe. Is that safe to say? It's to
pretty much, yeah. Yeah, that's
so that people aren't kind of dying on clinical trials left, right, and centre.
Yeah, and to be honest, to gatekeep them as well. You can't. It's very blunt, but I always say to people, you can't just go into the UK and jab people in the arm and say, "Oh no, it's fine. It's a clinical trial." You have to present the product, present the trial to the regulators and say, this is what we want to do. This is how we're going to make sure it's safe. This is what we see the benefits are going to be. This is ultimately what we're going to look for. And then those regulators will say, you have given us enough that we are allowing you to bring your trial into our country. And if they say, well, actually, we don't think it's safe enough and you haven't got enough oversight here and you haven't thought about this area enough, go away. But to your point, Cara, a lot of that was the science. It was how rigorous was the science. It wasn't, will the people in the UK who are on this trial have a good time? And I know that sounds really stupid, but that just wasn't the case. And I mentioned that, one of the regulations has just changed. We've had a couple of new ones in the industry. And to give you an idea, the original regulation, it was only on page 9. I was looking at it earlier for this. It was on page 9 that it finally said, basically, needs of the patient. Page 9. The new regulation, it is the number one principle, and it is on page 3. You've got the title, the contents, then that. It is now just a case of this is the number one thing. And this idea of now being the rights and the needs of the patient, the well-being of the patient, the safety of the patient, they're now starting to actually say, look, rather than just developing this trial that's going to say, right, you need to take 20 pills a day and you need to take them before bed or straight as soon as you wake up or whatever it's going to be. They've now sort of done it that they're saying, go to patients and ask them. Go to them, ask them about it. Say to them, look, how is this going to work? And is it going to be beneficial for people? They're getting patient advocacy groups involved. They're getting charities involved, just communities involved. And that's really a big, big key part now.
And it's so much the work that I'm definitely doing at the moment, right? In terms of, okay, my goodness, we need to kind of engage patients. Like, how do we do that in a meaningful way? And I think if you're a pharma organization out there, even listening, like, I think if you're kind of at that point where you're going one step beyond those regulatory, I guess, suggestions, well, not guidelines is probably a better word, right?
Yeah.
If you're going sort of like, well, how do we actually do this in a better and more meaningful way, then that's a really, really great place to be, right? Because it's very unknown territory, right, in terms of how we do this. So before I start babbling on around what I'm excited about in this space, what are you excited about, Rob? Like or rather, what do you still see as like the number one opportunity for patient experience in clinical trials?
I think the number one opportunity right now is the outliers. So not everybody is the same. And what that means is as simple things as there's something called ePro, which is basically an electronic patient report outcomes. In essence, in the olden days, as they would say, it was a paper diary. Patients used to write out a paper diary of how you're feeling each day, how it's going. Because once you get to a phase 3, you can't be in the hospital all the time. You have to go out and live your life while you're still on the trial. But you still need to collect all that data and feed it back. So it used to be loads of paper diaries. Now there's web portals, there's phone calls, there's text messages, there's apps, there's all sorts of different things. But again, it comes to that thing of everyone's slightly different. So some people might quite like having just an app that they can just quickly add bits to, especially younger generational people. That's fine. But if you get somebody who's maybe an older generation and you say to them, so what you need to do is you need to download this app, then you need to use your name and your password. Oh, and don't forget there's going to be a 2-factor code. That's going to be sent to your email. Have you got your email set up on this? That ain't going to work. They probably want someone to speak to. So they want a phone. They want to be able to talk to someone. Think about someone who maybe has mobility issues, and they can't interact. Think of, as daft as it sounds, even like someone who's colorblind, and they're having to just use an app that some UI designer somewhere who's creating these things to an engineering spec has gone, oh, well, we've made it on theme and on brand with our colors. It'll be fine. Well, it's not for these people. And I think that's where there's still some work to be done, that we're doing very good at the larger patient population now of understanding, what are the fundamentals for the patients on this trial? How often can they get to a clinic? How often can they take the product? When can they take the product? What is a tolerable side effect? But I think for those individuals, there's still that little bit, and it comes back to that thing of not being a burden, of, as daft as it is, having some joy. If you are suffering, if you are in pain, and then someone says, oh, don't forget you need to add all your details to the ePro tonight. Don't forget, we need you to fill in all that data. But you've been up all night being sick and you're just feeling rubbish. You need something that isn't going to be a burden to interact with. And I think that's where we still are moving towards, and I'm sure we will get on to AI at some point. That to me is where that's really going to play a good part, because I think there is some amazing things we can do now for the individuals.
I mean, it's not a podcast at the moment unless it does have something about AI, and you dropped it first, but it was the very next question. Because I think when we spoke before, you talked about kind of the power of AI to process kind of messy data that you get back sometimes. And I guess for me, it sounded like some of those use cases, whether it's an AI bot that you can interact with or talk to, it seems like AI has a part in quite a lot of this. Do you want to talk to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I think it's worth saying, I have gone down the AI rabbit hole. As you can probably tell, for someone who has their own mechanical keyboards, I've dabbled with having multiple agents and doing all these things. One of my big things right now is I refuse to look at spreadsheets. If someone sends me a spreadsheet, I now create interactive dashboards, because I am anti-spreadsheet. I've seen enough of them in my life. But one of the things that's amazing is this ability to create software and amend software. That barrier to entry and therefore the cost is dropping drastically. So let's use the colorblind example. You've got 10,000 patients and maybe only 0.5% are colorblind. to add into that experience a new view to just help them, understandably, it just might not be cost effective. There might not just be enough time to do it. Well, now, these tools and the fact that, you can utilize them with software development mean you can add in these additional features. I've been doing a lot of stuff recently with text to speech and speech to text. So the idea being that, you can type something in and a voice will speak. We all remember the Stephen Hawking's voice. That was a rudimentary text to speech. Well, now you can have really good voices. Now, again, if we think back to that thing of maybe someone wanting to talk to somebody or something, or maybe there's a child who just needs to be, have the right questions asked, suddenly having an app that can generate a voice to guide people is really helpful. The fact that rather than someone having to sit there on a night typing everything out on their phone, and they can just speak to it and do an audio diary. And then you said it, about the fact of basically cleaning up the data. One of the things that I said when we spoke was this idea of basically messy data and unstructured data. And what I mean in my world for that is free text. Basically, people just typing in whatever they want. And it could be as simple as somebody typing in, I had a headache, so today I took some paracetamol. Someone else might write, I had a headache today, I took some Anodin, because they refer to it as a brand name. Well, they both took basically the same thing, but they called it different things. Now, the old way of doing that would be to have 1 million boxes of metadata. The good old click a box, select from a drop-down, click a box, select from a drop-down. Again, that doesn't spark joy. So if you can have something that people can interact with naturally, if you can have speech to text, you can suddenly give the patients what they need, a more natural, a less invasive, a less time-consuming way to get the data in. And you can give the people on the other side, the scientists who need to look at the data, review the data, analyze the data, you can give it to them in structured ways that they're not having to spend weeks trying to go through it and realize that somebody misspelt a word or, there was an extra comma somewhere. And I think that really is where it's exciting. That ability that suddenly we can open up to give patients what they need and not have the technology constraints of before of saying, oh no, in order to do this, we used to give you pen and paper. Now you've got 20 drop-down boxes you need to pick. And if your option isn't in there, tough. Now we can actually say to them, no, you do what you need to do. We'll take care of it from there.
So Rob, what I'm hearing is in terms of taking a step back and thinking about the biggest opportunities in this space, and this very much resonates to me as well, right? It's kind of, what I'm hearing is sort of two things. It's one, we need to think about everyone, right? We need to not marginalize other people. We need to think about, because my experience on a trial would be very different to Philip's and yours, right? So how do we kind of really, I don't necessarily like the word personalize, but how do we not ostracize kind of potentially more marginalized groups, and how do we ensure that we're meeting the needs of everyone? And in another podcast, we can dig into some human-centered design methodologies that help drive those kind of that use case design, right? Because it is hard with such large sample sizes when we're talking about in clinical trials. So that's the first thing you're sort of saying, we've taken a little bit of a step. We're now actually thinking about patients. We've gone from page 9 to page 3, which is a huge win. But let's actually go to that next layer and let's actually think about everyone that we're designing for. And then the second thing is how do we bring those more specific experiences to life through incredible technologies like AI? I'm going to sort of wrap up with one sort of, well, it's not really a question. I'm just wondering if you could actually share the story around the trial with the epilepsy.
Yes.
Yeah,
So this was the first time I worked for a sponsor company. Now, when I say a sponsor, what I mean is basically a pharmaceutical company. Let's just name the big ones. I'm sure everyone's heard of your Pfizer's, with the COVID vaccine. You've heard of your AstraZeneca's, your GSK's. I worked for a company called GW Pharmaceuticals that was based in Cambridge in the UK. They're now part of a larger group, Jazz Pharmaceuticals, and they were doing a really interesting thing. They were looking at a special kind of epilepsy that is a pediatric epilepsy. So it's something that really impacts kids. And at least my understanding of it is it was something that when we think of epilepsy, we think of the flashing lights and, you suddenly have an epileptic fit or an episode. This wasn't that. This was hundreds, if not thousands, of almost like micro epileptic seizures constantly. And what that would do is it would basically introduce a level of brain damage. You're constantly firing at the brain, and it does serious damage. Now, what that meant is over time, if people did manage to survive this, they had long-term side effects because the constant firing of the brain and everything else just left them with disabilities. And GW came up with this idea of interestingly, using cannabinoid CBD oil. So we're all used to seeing the CBD oil in supermarkets and places. That a lot of the time is hemp. This was the actual classic marijuana cannabis CBD oil. And what they did was they found a way to produce this oil, and in giving it to these children, they went from having these constant episodes to almost nothing. And rather than, people being almost bedridden, they could live an almost natural life. and it was groundbreaking. They brought one of the children across before my time there, but the story resonated across the entire business for years to come. They brought someone across, I believe it was at Christmas, and gave them the product, gave them basically a test. Because again, if we think about, what you can and can't test, at some point you need to actually see, does this work? And it did. And they went into clinical trials and they came out the other end. And I remember part of the induction for the company, we've all done company inductions where you sit there and you read 100 SOPs, and maybe there's a recorded video from, the CEO saying, we're happy to have you all here in this family and all that stuff. This place, there was a half an hour video about the patients. Just the patients, just talking to patients. And a lot of the time as well, as I mentioned, the patients were kids, it was pediatric. So it's talking to the parents. And I mean, I don't care how much you've got a heart of stone. That really hits you. That was something that you genuinely sort of went, yeah, there's a difference being made here. This, I'm not trying to downplay it, but this isn't a ingrown toenail. This is, this is genuinely something that is going to change your life. And I remember having the inspection from the FDA and getting the approval, and there was tears, because some of the people had been there from the beginning, had been going to the sites and seeing the patients, had seen patients grow up, had seen them go through everything. It was mind-blowing, and it was really, for me as someone who had always been in this area, but as I say, really I was on the other side, not dealing with patients, dealing with just the samples. To me, a patient was ID 1234 and I just had 20 blood samples that I had to test. This was actually putting a genuine face and a name and a voice and a personality to the thing that we were doing. And that, I think for a lot of people, it hits hard.
I love that story. I mean, I think I shared this with you last time as well, Rob, that a lot of the teams I work with are from a clinical background, and so a lot of them throughout their whole career have never spoken to a patient, and obviously human-centered design, we get out into into the lives that these people are living, not necessarily just into the hospitals that they're receiving treatment on for a trial, but sort of going, okay, let's go and talk to these people. Let's understand how they live so that we can design parts of the trial to meet that, or design products and services. But I love the team members who are like, oh my God, I've been doing this for 30 years and I've never even spoken to a patient. Thank you so much, for facilitating that process. So it's so important to kind of get out and understand them. But last question, I guess, is how do we balance this kind of patient experience with regulation, the rules to keep us safe? Because both are so important, right? So how do we balance that to transform, reimagine clinical trials?
I think the thing, and this is what a lot of the regulators are now doing, and I really appreciate it, is I'll preface it with some people don't appreciate it, is
Okay.
they're giving guidance rather than rules now. And the reason I say some people don't like it is some people like rules. They like boundaries. They like to know exactly where they need to be. and if I do this, it's right. If I do this, it's wrong. So I'm going to do this. And what a lot of them are saying now is look, there isn't right or wrong. There isn't perfect. You can't do perfect. I'll try and find it at some point. There's a brilliant quote. There's a brilliant line in one of the regulations that reads like something out of a Taylor Swift song. And it's basically along the lines of the only way that you can achieve perfection is by putting in more effort and resources than what is actually viable. So don't. Focus where it matters. Focus, really where it's going to have an impact. And I think for a lot of people now, that is where the patient side comes in of, do we need it to be as strict as it was? Do we need to control everything? As long as we're looking after the patient well-being, as long as the data produced is in a state that is viable, that it is trustworthy, that you can tell where it's come from, how it was generated, do we need to turn around to people and say, oh, by the way, you need to do this, this, and this, and you need to take this at exactly this time, and you need to have a diet of this, and you need to do this, and you're not eligible because of this reason and that reason? Does that really have an impact? Is that really the risk? Is that there? And I like the fact that the regulations now are saying, look, we're not going to tell you what's right or wrong. We're just going to say to you, look, this is what you need to remember that's core to this. And as long as you're at the core, again, patient well-being, there's the safety, the data validity, the rest of the stuff is fine. Like, don't sweat it. It will be okay. And I think that's really having a big impact.
Yeah. One thing I like saying to my clients and businesses I work with is like, some patient experience is better than nothing. You know what I mean? Yeah. Some patient research is, just do something, and it's just like, I think people get really like, oh, we need to do a survey of 3,000 people and all this sort of stuff. No. Let's start small and just, something is better than nothing. And I think in terms of user experience, that's one thing I learned early on in my career, and something I always try and drive and remember is like, some UX is better than no UX, because it might be that difference between somebody understanding that consent form to be able to go on that trial and not, it's just like those little simple things. We're going to wrap it up there, Rob. Thank you so much for being a part of the Design for Impact podcast.